Welcome back to the Left Library, the home of simplified political theory. Today we're diving deeper into Friedrich Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, a critical text that lays the foundation for understanding why socialism, according to Marxist theory, is not just an idealistic dream, but a scientifically grounded necessity. So let's dive in. Engels opens by critiquing the early socialist thinkers, including Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen, for their attempts to design perfect societies. While they were reacting to the exploitation and chaos of early capitalism, their methods were fundamentally idealistic. They relied on moral persuasion, believing that if they could just convince people to follow their utopian blueprints, a harmonious society would somehow emerge. Engels doesn't dismiss these figures entirely. He credits them for recognizing the social injustices created by capitalism. However, they lacked a scientific understanding of how history develops and what drives social change. He explains, open quote, "The utopians know nothing of the conditions under which their favorite social systems could be realized," end quote. They fail to see that societal transformations are driven not by goodwill or idealism, but by material conditions and class struggles. And this brings us to the core of Engels' argument. What makes socialism scientific? Engels and Marx developed scientific socialism by grounding their theory in historical materialism. Instead of imagining a perfect society that could be built through moral efforts alone, they analyzed the real economic forces at work in society and how these forces create the potential for socialism. Historical materialism is key to this. It's the idea that the material conditions of a society, so how it produces goods and organizes its labor, then determines its social structures, political systems, and ideologies. Social change, therefore, isn't driven by ideas alone, but by changes in the economic base of any society. The contradictions within the capitalist mode of production itself will lead to the rise of socialism. Engels reiterates, open quote, "Socialism is no longer an accidental discovery of this or that ingenious brain, but the necessary outcome of the struggles between two historically developed classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie," end quote. Class struggle is at the heart of this scientific analysis. For Engels, history progresses through conflict between opposing classes, and under capitalism, this conflict is between the bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production, and the proletariat, those who sell their labor. The capitalist system, by its very nature, intensifies this struggle, leading to the eventual overthrow of the bourgeoisie by the working class. Engels doesn't view capitalism purely negatively. In fact, he acknowledges that capitalism has advanced human society by revolutionizing production and increasing wealth on an unprecedented scale. But capitalism also creates contradictions that in the long term make it unsustainable. One of the central contradictions is overproduction. Capitalism's drive for profit leads to the constant expansion of production. However, because the system pays workers only a fraction of the value that they produce, the market becomes saturated with goods that people can't afford to buy. This leads to crises of overproduction, where commodities pile up unsold, factories shut down, and workers thrown into unemployment. Engels describes it as follows, open quote, "The more capitalism develops, the more it is compelled to develop the productive forces, and the more it destroys its own foundation by producing crises," end quote. These crises, far from being anomalies, are built into the very structure of capitalism. As the system becomes more productive, it intensifies these contradictions, leading to ever worsening economic crises and deeper social unrest. The outcome? The working class, which suffers the most from these crises, becomes increasingly conscious of its own position. The growing immiseration of the proletariat leads to the organisation of the working class, which will eventually rise up and overthrow the capitalist system. Engels' dialectical materialism is the philosophical framework underpinning scientific socialism. Borrowing from Hegel's Dialectics, but stripping it of its idealism, Marx and Engels viewed history as driven by material conditions. For them, social change occurs through the resolution of these contradictions. Capitalism's contradictions will lead to its demise and the rise of socialism. Engels emphasizes that just as capitalism replaced feudalism, socialism will inevitably replace capitalism. The internal contradictions within each mode of production create the conditions for its own downfall and the rise of a new system. This understanding of historical development is what makes socialism scientific. It's not an abstract moral idea, but a historical necessity. Engels explains that socialism will emerge not because people want it to, but because capitalism itself will collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. He writes, open quote, "The solution of the problems which the utopians put forward will be found in the dialectical development of capitalism's own contradictions, not through a dream, but through science." End quote. As capitalism crumbles, the proletariat, the class created and exploited by capitalism, will rise to seize the means of production. Engels makes it clear that the revolution will not come through small utopian experiments or by moral persuasion. Instead, it will come through the organised power of the working class, driven by the material conditions of capitalist exploitation. Once the working class takes power, it will abolish the capitalist system of private ownership and establish a socialist system based on collective ownership of the means of production. Engels argues that this isn't just a possibility, but a necessity based on scientific analysis. Open quote. "The working class cannot emancipate itself without abolishing the conditions of its own existence, which have been created by capitalism." End quote. In other words, to free itself, the working class must destroy the very system that oppresses it. Engels concludes by reinforcing the idea that socialism is no longer a utopian dream, but a scientific theory grounded in material reality. Utopian socialists, despite their good intentions, lacked the scientific understanding of class struggle and historical development. Marx and Engels, through their analysis of capitalism's contradictions, provided the framework for understanding how and why socialism would emerge. Scientific socialism isn't just about envisioning a better future, it's about understanding the material conditions that make that future possible. Capitalism's crises, its exploitation of the working class, and its internal contradictions will inevitably lead to its own downfall. Socialism is not a question of if, but when. As Engels writes, socialism is, open quote, "the necessary outcome of the development of capitalism itself." End quote. If you found this breakdown helpful, please do subscribe to the Left Library for more deep dives into Marxist and political theory. Let us know in the comments what you'd like us to take a look at next. Thank you, and we'll see you again.